I am Stéphane Aquin, the Chief Curator at the Hirshhorn, and it is my privilege to welcome you today to today's installment of Talking to Our Time with artist Paul Chan. And the theme today is on art and the screen age. So Paul will be in conversation with curator Marina Isgro. Thank you, Paul. We look forward to hearing about your extraordinary work as an artist, as a publisher, as a writer, as an artist again. We've had many lives. And for those of you among our audience who have not yet tuned into our Artist Diary series, please do so on the website. And actually Theaster Gates, video quotes, writings from Paul Chan's selected writings. And I also invite you to join in to next week's installment of Talking to Our Time with Canadian artists A.A. Bronson and Adrian Stimson on art and healing with curator Betsy Johnson. I also want to, before we begin, to acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homeland we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. And we'll be hearing more about these communities next week with Adrian Stimson, of course. Now, please welcome Paul Chan and Marina Isgro, and thank you for being here. Up to you guys.
Okay. Hi, Paul.
You hear me?
Yes, all good. So thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with Paul Chan. I'm sure many of you already know his work very well, so I won't give too long of an introduction. But over the past 20 years, he's developed a wide-ranging artistic practice, addressing subjects including war, religion, politics, and philosophy across media, from video and performance to sculpture to drawing and writing. He's had solo exhibitions at major institutions in the US and abroad, was the 2014 recipient of the Hugo Boss Prize. And in addition to working as an artist, he also founded and ran Badlands Unlimited, the publishing company. So thank you so much, Paul, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so as you know, I have been a great fan of your work since I saw your early films and animations. I think I came to it through Baghdad in no particular order, which is the kind of experimental documentary you made in Iraq immediately prior to the US invasion. And it's been so fascinating to see how your work has developed and changed since then. So I thought of you for this talk in particular, because I read an interview where you spoke about reaching what you call peak screen. So you had really taken up video as your primary medium. You had become very much associated with that medium. And then you kind of hit this saturation point and you took a hiatus from the art world and then came back and started thinking about ways to approach or explore the moving image that didn't involve screens and that didn't involve conventional recording technologies. So I thought now would be an extremely appropriate time to revisit that transition when I think so many of us are going through a similar kind of screen fatigue. So that's what we'll do today.
Yeah, it's really self-care, really. It's like a self-care workshop.
It's self-care, but it's happening on Zoom, which is perhaps ironic. So maybe we can start with one of your really early and iconic animations, My Birds Trash the Future. Sure. Paul, do you want to introduce that work to us briefly, and then we'll show a 2-minute clip from it?
Sure. It's an earlier work. It's 2006, 2005, I forget. It's a 2-sided projection. So it's a specially built screen that floats in the middle of a room, and the projections are on either sides. And they're of the same scene, but of different perspectives. Literally, it's a 180-degree perspective. And so if you look at the animation on one side, and if you walk around the screen, you'll see the same screen, but from the back side. So on side A, if you see the face of a person, if you physically walk to the back of the screen to see the second projection, you'll see the back of the person. And I drew it this way so that you can see this back and forth of 2 different perspectives. And, and I think, there's a lot going on, but there are 7 scenes and it's around 14 minutes. I forget.
Virginia.
Yeah, so let's just show it and we can talk about it.
Cool. Okay, let's show that clip. Okay. You're shaking your head, Paul.
I haven't seen it in a long time.
Yeah.
I'm just following I'm starting to remember the score that I made for it, for the rhythm, for the speed. It's really, I'm looking for a certain polyphony of movements, and that comes from animating things at different speeds. And so I'm just remembering the score that I had to animate that.
Yeah,
Wow.
and I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I chose this particular clip, because it does seem to dovetail so much with your current work on the breathers. You have this wind that's rushing through this quasi-apocalyptic scene. It's this sort of unseen, powerful natural force. In other works, you work with gravity, for example. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how the wind is functioning here, and maybe how it functions throughout your work.
Sure. It's breath, it's air. I think that's a simple way of talking about it. We can't see it, but it influences things that move. I sometimes I don't know if you do this, I don't know if anyone does this. I sometimes look up at trees, at the tops of trees, and see them moving because of the wind. But I then actively think about it, the fact that there's no wind. And so if I do that, it looks like the trees are alive, because in my mind, I've actively suppressed the idea that wind is moving them, and somehow they're moving on their own. And it's an uncanny feeling when I reach this felt experience of seeing trees move on their own. And I find it incredibly pleasurable and scary, and just helps me be here.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of weird combination of things that I look for when I animate or when I make work that is moving image based. The paper flying across in that storm there's a wind sound, but I can almost imagine them moving on their own. And so in a way, it's slightly animistic, it's slightly not, it's unclear what it is, you know. I also, just as a hot tip, which no one talks about, because I don't really talk about it, and maybe they don't want to remember it, but you know, that piece of paper is very specific, those pieces of paper. Do you recognize it?
It's from the Windows icon, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
old Windows,
I
old Windows
remember
for a
that.
copy of file. There's an animation of a piece of paper flying from one folder to another. And I spent literally weeks redrawing that and doing it in different variations so that I can create a storm of digital trash that flies across this landscape, which looks a lot like America 2020, frankly. And so it was really pleasurable and intense and hard, but it was just looking at it. It's just, yeah, I think it was worth it. I don't know, hard to say.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to that question about animacy that you brought up and maybe take a step back and think about animation and how you got to animation. Because I think now, you know, there are so many young artists working with animation as their primary medium, but you started, I think, in 1999 when you were still in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about what drew you to animation and maybe what possibilities it opened up for you?
Sure. I began animating because I didn't have money. I was in undergrad in Art Institute of Chicago, and I had an inkling of an idea to work with the images of the great outsider artist Henry Darger, and to correlate it with the insanely interesting and strange philosophy of a French utopian socialist, Charles Fourier. I saw a kind of elective affinity between those two, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And so, as someone who went to school for film video, you naturally think, well, I should make a video, you know, using a video camera with people playing parts, almost like a movie shoot. It is a movie shoot, an epic movie shoot with hundreds and thousands of people in costumes in these idyllic landscapes and war-torn situations. And I worked on it for a couple years and realized I neither had the money nor the temperament to achieve it. I simply am too introverted, maybe, too naive. Certainly didn't have the money for a budget like that. And so, but that didn't stop me because I'm stupid. And so I thought, well, why don't I just draw it? Why don't I just try drawing it first to see how it would work? And before that, I had never animated before. But it was through necessity. It was through deprivation that allowed me to think differently about what I was going to make. And so I downloaded, a hacked version of Macromedia Flash, taught it to myself, and spent the next 4.5 years drawing it, learning on my own how to animate under the terms, not of the application, but under the terms that I wanted to see how these things can move. And so that was the beginning, really. It was really, and I assume artists who are starting animating now are under the same pressures and the opportunities that, you know, we're all quarantined right now. We can't really work with other people, but that doesn't mean you stop making stuff. And so what can you do with the means that are available? And I think animation is always one of them for people who are interested in making moving image works.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you specifically about the intersection of animation with violence, which is something that kind of recurs in these early works. So we watched the very beginning of this video, but as it continues, you see these two figures kind of encountering all kinds of natural disasters and human violence and disaster. And I think there are some critics who would say that animation is perhaps inadequate to express the reality of violence, right? Because it doesn't follow the rules of the real world. Like if a cartoon dog gets hit by a rock, it just bounces back and it's fine. But I wonder if you could sort of make the opposite argument and think about why animation might be well equipped to think about violence.
I think I'm agnostic about that question.
Yeah.
You know, I've worked enough in media and have been personally a part of enough movements and organizing work to be agnostic about its potential, its capacity for us to understand it more. What I know, though, is that within the framework of drawing a picture and making it move, I give myself a certain freedom to relate that, what we call violence, with other things. Perhaps peace, perhaps happiness, perhaps sadness, other feels that may be associated with violence. And I think maybe that's the most important part, that I think in animation and moving image work in general, for me, my capacity to correlate different elements with other ones as efficiently and elegantly and as directly as I can, without filler, quote unquote, I think is what matters to me. Yeah. And I think, I don't know if I'm attracted to violence as much as we've lived in incredibly violent times for our lifetime, and so I think if there's any work that art can do, it is to help us think to the brink.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important part.
So maybe just one last thing on my birds. Can we look at those installation photos? I think there are 3 install shots. So I'm wondering just if you could talk a little bit more about that two-sided projection format, because for me, this is sort of the beginning of your thinking about complicating the screen and complicating projection.
Sure. I think fundamentally, I resent the power of video in the moving image, baby. It's video projection work, and video work is incredible. I mean, I grew up with it. There are some incredible video and film artists making incredible work. And I was a part of there was a time in my life when video and moving image projection was very important to my work and my thinking about what to make. But I also know that there are certain qualities about video projection and video work in general that I always resisted. One of them is the lack of scale. So, video projections can be as small as now in the palm of your hand via your smartphone to the sides of buildings. They can be projected that large. So that could be seen as an asset, as a good quality, but I actually find it to be not a quality I'm interested in. I actually don't like it, because my experience with art has always been about a scale, a particular scale in relations to our bodies. And so in a way, in a very direct way, all of my early video work, projection work, is really scaled a specific way. This size of the screen never changes. It's very specific. And it's because it architecturally relates to your body or general size of a human body. And once I fix that size of the screen, then I can fix the size of the animated elements in there so that it relates to us at a certain scale. This is true for happiness, the earlier work. This is true for the floor projections. They never get big. There's a specific size to them. And I think what's important for me is that at that time, perhaps even now, but with different stakes now, at that time, that the moving image never overwhelms us, that it never becomes a kind of spectacle that incapacitates us and stops us in our tracks because it is so overwhelming and big or intense. I really, I don't like those experiences. I don't like people who do that to us. And so I try not to make work like that. There's some things to be said about making work that overwhelms you, that sort of puts you in a state where your senses feel overwhelmed and that you're kind of in a stasis. But I hate that. I find that to be cruel, and so I don't make work like that.
Well, that's a great transition. You mentioned the floor projection, so why don't we jump to those? Yeah, so these are the 7 Lights, very well-known works from 2005, 2006. This is an install shot from the Hirshhorn, actually, from 2008 in a show called The Cinema Effect. We can just scroll through the rest of those installation shots. And then I think we have a clip of the third light.
Okay.
So maybe we'll just look at like the first minute of that clip.
Sure.
Great. Okay. So as you saw, these works are projected primarily on the floor. Some of them also overlap the wall. But the effect is as if you're seeing light kind of streaming through your window and showing you the silhouettes of these objects that are outside your window reflected onto the floor. For me, these evoke something different every time I see them. I think the first time, you created them in 2005, 2006, very close to September 11th, which is how they were sort of read in that moment. For me now, it's all about sort of the position of the viewer and the interiority of it all. So you're really trapped inside, only catching kind of glimpses of the outside world in the form of these partial or incomplete images through your window. And I'm wondering how you're seeing them now and whether you do think about interiority as being an important part of them.
I think you're right. I think your experience with them aligns with mine. I have other, I made them. I think of other things like the mistakes I made and the things I wish I would have done. Also the stuff that I liked, like the shaking of the dog's tails.
That's so good.
Is really, and I remember animating them, knowing that I had to animate them at different speeds because different dogs have different tail wagging speeds, and because it emotes a different emotion, right? A slow dog wag as opposed to a fast one, right? Or even the cats as they're floating up, a certain movement of their paw, a certain movement of their tails. It's never fast like a dog, it's very slow. It's really the rhythm of the movement. It's the movingness as opposed to the image. And so that's what I think of. I think the interiority, I think the feeling of outside and inside is very important for these works, because you're right that they were made with the framework of imagining you being in your kitchen or in your bedroom and it's afternoon light streaming through a window. And what are the shadows that you can see as this light streams through your window? So it's a very almost domestic, very quiet framework that I'm thinking of. And, and none of the projections have sound, they're all silent. And so that's certainly what I had in mind when I was making them. I think also, I think about the shadow. I think about how silent they are and also how quickly they can register to us as what it is without having a discernible outline or sense of detail. I mean, it's a remarkable way of understanding images when you realize there are certain things in the world where it can register to us just a microsecond and we get it instantly, right? You know, you've had those experiences where you can feel a shadow going over your whole body and you just know it's a plane, right? Or you ever had those experiences where a cloud goes over you and the air just turns a little cooler just for 3 seconds as that shadow goes over you? That's the feel that I'm looking for when I make those things. I think certainly the images of people falling that was most well known and through the tragedy of 9/11 is a part of the iconography of it, but also all the things that we have to face and deal with and perhaps live with and against during that time is all in that too. Folding chairs, cats, dogs, weapons, subway cars. First Light has a subway train floating up into the sky, and it's the F train, because I hate the F train, because at the time it was so terrible. So I wish the F train would leave Earth and go somewhere else.
Amazing. So I wanted to ask you kind of about the relationship between this body of work and the video that we saw previously, My Birds, because in both of them, you're addressing sort of this idea of apocalypse potentially. Here it could be creation, right? The 7 days of creation. And I want to ask you about your attraction to these moments of, origin or ending. What do you think brings you there repeatedly?
I think that's a great question. And I hope someone will tell me someday. I think part of it is really perhaps the nature of the medium of projection, of loops, of the very pragmatic idea of making moving image projections that loop means, among other things, beginnings and endings, thinking about them become very important. So formally speaking, it's kind of baked into the framework, I think. I also have a curious enthusiasm for philosophy. It's what I read as a kid to make myself feel better about the fact that I was ugly and unwanted. I'm just kidding. It's what I read when I was young to try to make sense of the world and myself. We read many things. We read stories, we read poems, stereo manuals, menus, I don't know. But what I read was philosophy. And whether or not I get anything from it, I understand the terrain of philosophical thought and how they tried to think to the brink about what it means to begin, what it means to end, in the broadest sense of the term. And so I think part of the flavor of the work comes from that. And I think once you are serious about thinking about this peculiar field of endeavor called philosophy, you soon realize that the language philosophy is so enriched and also debased by other bodies of knowledge, like history of religion, for instance, history of politics, history of literature. And so in a way, they all mix in a way to help me come to terms with what it is I'm seeing and feeling. I think that's also an aspect of it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we should probably jump to the breathers in the interest of time. So we're also jumping in time a little bit here. You took a hiatus from art starting in 2009 to work on your publishing company, Badlands Unlimited. And then you came back to art in 2014. And shortly after that, started developing this body of amazing inflatable sculptures that you call the breathers. So let's just look at a short clip of one of these. This is Penta Sophia, which I think is now in the Guggenheim's collection. Great. So could you talk about, say that again?
I'm glad you played the sound because it's scary.
It is scary. It is scary. I think the other ones might not have sound on them, but we'll see. Could you talk about your transition away from traditional moving image work to the breathers? how you got there, and also this idea of animation, whether you see these as animated in some form, whether you see them in dialogue with your digital animation or not.
Sure. You know, I think I can talk about it in relation to what you brought up earlier about peak screen, about screen
Yeah.
fatigue. And I felt that around 2008, 2009. I'd been heavily invested in making moving image works that gets projected from video projectors or shown on video monitors. And I love that work. I learned a lot from making it, but I was done. And, you know, there are many reasons why I stopped making art. And that was certainly one of them. That I think I reached an end point of making that kind of work, projection work. But I didn't know what else to do. And so because of that, I just stopped. I just stopped making work. That I wasn't interested, I wasn't invested, I wasn't inspired by it. It actually, it pained me to think that I would keep making work for screens. And this was just at a time when smartphones were coming into its own, right? But I could see it coming in a way because I've been invested in screens for so long. And so I spent years not making work. One of the reasons is I didn't know what to make. And I didn't know what the stakes were really, you know, like where the stakes for to make work people pay attention to. Was it stakes because I wanted to make something that I could be proud of or that I find interesting? I didn't know. And it wasn't until around 2016, 2017, where I realized that where I wanted to do. And to clarify the idea of what it was I was making, you know, and we've talked about this before, that fundamentally around that time I realized if I'm someone who makes moving image works, it wasn't necessarily the image that mattered to me as much as the moving part. Mm-hmm. It was choreographing elements to move in a way like music, that mattered to me more than the actual images. The images were almost in a way a placeholder for what I thought was more essential, which is seeing something move and correlating with other things that move to give us a kind of composition over time, right? And so I think when I realized that, I think I opened up my own mind about what was possible. Well, if all I was interested in moving stuff, then maybe other fields or other ways of making work is possible, you know? You know, of course there's dance, performance, choreography. That's a form of movement, you know, but I didn't want to work with people. Or let's just say that I'm not at my best when I work with people. I can, but I think I'm looking for a particular kind of pleasure and progress that comes from being in a rabbit hole. And so that's how philosophically the Breathers began. I mean, practically it began when I was using the space of Rachel Harrison, the great artist who just had a retrospective at the Whitney. I was using her space, and in the space there was a fan, a floor fan, and the space was not the cleanest space, and she left stuff there, and so I was just rummaging through her stuff, and there was a fan. There was a floor fan there. But and it was just a regular Home Depot fan, right? That you would cool a space in. But what was interesting was that it was broken. And so all it would do is point upwards. It wouldn't blow this way. It would only blow this way. And I kept looking at the fan. I thought, God, that reminds me of something. And then I realized it looks like the fans that you would see were these fabric tubes are connected to that you'd see at used car dealerships, what they're called sky dancers. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. Those things move. But I've never sewn before. I've never made those things before. And so that was the beginning. So me and my assistant at the time, Cassie, sewed one, and it was terrible. It didn't move. It just bent over. There was no hole for the air to go through. And so it just was, the air would go in and come out. But I was so taken by it. It just did this. And it was like something having an asthma attack. And I was entranced ever since.
Yeah, you brought up asthma, and I think you've actually related them in the past to your experiences with asthma.
You know, I think part of the attraction and part of the recurring motif of wind,
Yeah.
And breathing, I think, comes from a very particular place, and and a large part of it is knowing what it's like to not be able to breathe, knowing what it's like to be debilitated with lack of oxygen. You know, and this is certainly not a unique situation. There are many people with asthma and breathing conditions. Those of us who have breathing conditions are the barometers for air pollution, frankly, you know? And so I'm very aware of breath and air. But what's interesting also is how breath and air play such a large part in certain bodies of philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, for instance. The word is pneumia. And pneumia was a very important aspect of what classical Greek philosophers thought life was about, that there was no life without breath. Bios, what's called life, can only come about through the relationship with pneumia. And so I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah, so maybe we can look at the teeny lemnicus. I think we have the next clip. This is a breather that you have described, I think, as a self-portrait. Is that right?
Yeah.
So let's see this one move. So in what way would you describe this as self-portraiture?
It is the feeling of having an attack so that you're so debilitated you can't lift a towel. Also, this is probably, you know, breathers. Each breather has its own quality of movement, whether people recognize it or not. I think, and it took a couple years to get just this movement. It's easy to make a breather where it acts like they're on meth, where they're just ecstatic and just going everywhere, right? This is what the physics of what the sky dancers are. They were made to grab your attention by any means necessary. And that tends to be movement that looks like you're on meth. To make movement that is more subtle, that has the hip movement and that has the kind of shoulder movement so that it looks like something is struggling with something as light and as simple as this sort of lightweight nylon, I think is much more difficult. And it takes a kind of folk engineering for it to be achieved, which is completely pleasurable to try to figure out. Because once you get it, it's like a portrait of a person as a movement, you know. So it took a long time because I needed a certain quality of movement. You know, I know when a breather is right when it reflects a certain quality of movement that is in my mind that triggers something. Right. And this really does. It makes me feel like I'm having an asthma attack.
To what extent can you control every facet of their movement? Are there ways in which they escape your control sometimes, or they surprise you?
They always escape your control. The movement that you have in my mind never works out the way it is. So it's always a kind of relationship. Because when I started making these, I realized the body of knowledge I needed to know was fluid mechanics. The capacity for you to understand and predict movement of liquids over time. In this case, the liquid is air. And so mechanically, it's just a fan with air going through it, right? On fabric. And then there's an opening. And so the question is, if you want it to go this way, or that way, or this way, you have to know how to predict and understand the air pressure, the friction of the air against the fabric, the opening and how it relates to the speed of the air going through. And all those aspects contribute to the science and art of fluid dynamics, fluid mechanics. And I tried to get in touch with engineering and physics professors at NYU to help me, and they threw me out of the room because no one wanted to help an artist make these things. But I don't blame them, because I needed to figure it out on my own in a way. So in a way, the last 4 or 5 years on, it's been a kind of folk engineering of understanding air pressure, air forces, air friction, so that you can compose in such a way that they move at least to the degree to which it can evoke a certain feel.
That makes sense.
You never get it, but you sort of work with it to a point where it gets somewhere, as opposed to nowhere.
Right. I wonder if you could talk about sort of temporality in these. For me, one of the most interesting things is, like, unless you literally unplug it or turn it off, they're always moving. And it sometimes feels like they can't stop moving, like in an anxious way, is this sort of drive to keep going. I wonder how you think about that.
I think that's true. I think, and depending upon the fan size, the feeling of relentlessness, I think,
exactly.
increase. In a way, practically speaking, I think of them like video loops. When you, I'm sure you know, as a curator, to install a video projection, ideally you just turn on the video projector and the device that's playing it, and it just loops and it just goes, right? No fuss, no muss. I think the ambition for these works is, practically speaking, like that of a video loop, that you should just be able to turn on the fan and it'll just animate on its own. You don't have to do anything, it just goes. And so practically speaking, that's how I think of it. And so engineering wise, that's how I'm trying to engineer it, so that even if the breather moves so that it looks like it's falling to the ground, it has the capacity, enough air pressure for it to get back up, And I think, in a way, it's almost like building a campfire. You know how, I can't predict the movements. What I can do is create a situation where a certain movement is not only acceptable, but prized. And in a way, then develop it so that the likelihood of it returning to that movement is more likely than not, while at the same time be able to continue to stand up. Kind of like building a fire, like you can't control the flames. What you can do is control the situation of how the flame can more or less interact with its environment. And I'd like to think that, I think when they work, they're as entrancing as a campfire.
Yeah, you talked about that, the kind of attention that they evoke. Maybe let's show the last clip that we have here of Kara and Tria.
Sure.
So I don't know if you heard this, but I lived in Philadelphia for a long time, and they tried to ban tube men.
Oh yeah?
Yeah. The city council tried to ban them because it was felt that, they're attention grabbing to the point that they're obnoxious, right? in the usual form. So I wonder how you think about kind of the attention that your work evokes and how that differs from kind of the classic tube men.
Oh, I don't know if they do differ, to tell you. I think it's a temperament of mine, I guess. It reminds me of something Bertolt Brecht used to say, that we should never start with the good old things, but the bad new things. I think even the earlier video animations, whether people recognize it or not, they're the proportions of early internet ads, banner ads. And they're the most annoying things still, right? The ads, the long horizontal ads in your email account or something, or on the bottom of whatever website you're looking at. They're more obnoxious now, frankly. But back then, they were truly obnoxious because they were made to grab your attention regardless of what page you were going to. But what I found interesting about them was the lengths they will go to get your attention, which compelled a certain innovation in animation. I thought some of the most interesting and innovative animated moving image works were banner ads in the early 2000s. And in a way, happiness after 35,000 years of civilization, even my bird trash in the future, take from that kind of ethos, I suppose. And so to me, it's of the same piece as using sky dancers, these completely debased, this completely debased motif. I like starting from what is discarded or unused, or what is considered debased. I think it's it enlivens my work to start there. Mm-hmm. Whether or not I end up there, I don't know. But I like to start there.
Great. Well, we have some great questions coming in, so I think I'll just ask you one more thing and then we'll switch over to those.
Sure.
I did want to ask you about your recent writing, because you have been publishing during the pandemic, and I think ArtNet called you a surprising source of reassurance since the pandemic took hold earlier this year. So I wanted to ask you just, you've been thinking for years about art's role in moments of crisis, and I'm wondering whether the last few months have kind of changed your thinking at all or not?
I think everything has changed. I'm not aware of a time on Earth where it's been like this. I've never lived through a time like this. I don't know if you have. I don't know if others. I don't know if it's a change as much as it has provided an opportunity to truly reflect on what the stakes are about things. And one of the stakes for me is art, right? So, given in a time when we're in a global pandemic, where there's no real leadership to help anyone, given a time when the image of this country as being riven with systematic racism is now to the fore, and given the uncertainty of the social and political climate, are there any stakes available? Are there any stakes worth having in something as something like art? And that's a great question. That's a question I ask, and so I think so I've been grateful for the opportunities to be able to speak my mind about these things, So is it possible to be engaged and present to all that ails us, to what the day demands, as Goethe may say, and be able to make a claim for why it matters for us to remember that there's something called art? There may not be. That's a good question, whether the times have any use for something like art in its many multifaceted forms and ways of thinking about it. But I think I felt like I owed it to myself, at the very least, to try to articulate it, because it wasn't so long ago when I was an art student in my 20s. And I can't imagine what it's like being a young artist or an art student in their 20s now, going through all of this and thinking about, why does any of this work that I make in my studio or bedroom or kitchen, why does it matter? And so I wanted to speak to the art student, a young artist that I once was, to see if I can come up with a reason why it ought to. Whether or not it does, I don't know, but I gave it the old college try.
Thank you. So we have so many questions. I think we should dive into them. If anyone else has a question, just feel free to hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We have one from Colleen Smith. Hello, Colleen Smith.
Colleen!
She says, please elaborate on the cruelty of immersive video images as it relates to scale. Is it about the way in which the moving image can completely swallow the viewer and erase their agency, or something else? Also, the shoe plugs, are they really moving electricity? Thank you, Paul.
Colleen Smith, do people know? The great filmmaker, video artist, Colleen Smith, also drawer, had a show at the Whitney. I'm plugging Colleen Smith. Oh, I even forgot the question. Let's take the plug question first. Yes, they do. Some do, some don't. But I do have the capacity to pass electricity. I make these concrete shoes with plugs in them. I also make these specialty cords. This was before I developed the breathers. And before I developed the breathers, I thought, well, maybe I can make art, maybe I can make work about what happens before the projection. And before the projection, it's electricity. And so I essentially designed my own system of extending electricity through power cords in shoes. And so I do use them sometimes. I still use them. They're an important part. I love shoes. I have a shoe fetish. What was the other question?
It was about scale. Yeah.
Cruelty. I think that's one of the reasons why I've never made an immersive environment. It's one of the reasons why I keep the video work at a particular scale. I do think it's cruel. You know, it's not unlike, you know, I think we've all enjoyed our experiences in a dark room, like a movie theater, you know, where you're completely enveloped by the screen, right? IMAX, whatever. It's just the feeling of you sitting in a room, dark room, and seeing a movie. I think it can be very pleasurable. But I think the experience of art I'm looking for is always much more bodily, regardless of scale, regardless of medium, actually, you know, from painting to sculpture, even reading. You know, my experience as a publisher is that the experience of reading is much more full-bodied than we are willing to admit. Because as a publisher, I realized not only is the experience of reading dictated by the words on the page, but also by the page itself, the feel of the page, the weight of the book, even the smell of the book, right? Also, what we remember from reading may also come from the fact of the light coming in the room, the situation in which you're reading. Reading is much more full-bodied than we'll ever admit to, and I learned that as a publisher. And I got that sense of insight from making video work that refused to forget the body as a way in which we correlate with something as prized and as valued and as precious as an experience worth remembering.
Great. Another question from Greg Allen. He says, you've made elaborate and critical websites and works on ebook and PDF that have disappeared from public view, and you've carved a book into a giant granite slab. How do you approach the archival or the permanence or the ephemerality of what you make?
Greg Allen, is that the guy who runs greg.org?
I think it is, yeah.
It's nice to get a question from Greg Allen. Do I approach the archival? I guess I don't. Is that right? It's not a priority for me, let's just say. Especially, how do I say this? If a person prizes moments, that person may prize the moment more than what that moment can contribute later on after the moment has passed. I think in a way, I think of a great writer who once said, you know, the prototypical artwork is fireworks. They long to burn an image into our mind as we experience it, which can last as long and which can be as lasting as anything made out of stone or steel. And I tend to agree with that. I consider the internet an ephemeral media. And so I don't treat it as if it will remember everything or need to. And so things come and go, and I'm okay with it. And in fact, it's important that things go, because then we can truly take stock of what matters, I suppose. You know, it's not to say that things I've taken offline doesn't matter. It's only that I think the moment for me has passed, and it's to move on means letting it go.
Right. Okay, so here's one from Alberto Gaitan. He says, can you tell us about the way you choose or generate the sound palette for these videos that have a score and how you approach composition? Yeah, I'd love to hear you talk about like the cell phone rings and the little MIDI sounds in the video that we saw.
Sure, earlier on in the videos, I think cell phones had ringtones, and I loved those 8-bit ringtones, so I used them. I spent a little time understanding music composition. And so in a way, the scores are the musical scores for them, and also the visual scores look a lot like musical compositions. And I use the grammar of musical composition to think of them. I think of just very basically whether this moment in the animation should be largo or fortissimo or adagio. And so, and how does it transition into another speed? I think of it very musically. I'm not very musically oriented, but I have a strange, almost synesthetic sense of visual rhythm. I need it. I need things to move with a certain polyphony. And so music becomes the grammar in which I try to describe that to myself so that I can create them. It's true for breathers too. I have scores for the breathers for how they're supposed to move. And so in a way, you know, if you think of it like a song, the earlier video works are like 14-minute songs, but the breathers, their basic movement is, let's say the loop is around 30 seconds. And so it's like a 30-second song that I'm trying to, that plays over.
Right. You also made, I think, a score for the Seventh Light, right?
I did. Yeah. There are 6 projections and one score. I felt it would have been sad if I actually made a Seventh Light, and so I decided not to make one and instead score it. And it's a typical musical score, except with no notes and just ripped pieces of paper. And someone actually tried to play it. A quartet tried to play it in Basel, Switzerland, years ago. I don't know how it sounded.
Oh, I gotta look that up. Okay, Roshan Iyer, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, says, what do you think of the possibilities offered by VR or 3D printing as mediums for the future of your field?
Can you ask them if they're from a company of some kind that makes VR or 3D printing?
Roshan, if you're out there, you can type something in.
I think there are great artists who are making VR work. I will never be one of them. I find the experience of VR the same as an immersive installation environment. It's a little claustrophobic for me, and also diminishes my capacity to understand what's happening because it reduces the senses just to the head, right? It's just, VR is like a headset where it blocks your view, so you only see the screens, and tends to block your ears too. And so I feel a little blinded by it. So, I haven't done anything with it, and I don't plan to. 3D printing, I haven't thought much about. I have problems with 2D printing, so I don't know if I would venture into 3D printing.
Cool. So I think we can do one last question. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
Cool. So this is from Rima Ghazi. She says, do you feel like memory or nostalgia plays an important role in your work?
Oh, I think memory and nostalgia plays a role in everyone's lives. It certainly is an aspect of what I do. Whether it is the telos of what I do, the purpose of what I do, I think is debatable. My guess is not, but it's hard to say, you know. I think in my experience, making work means, among other things, getting yourself into kind of aesthetic and intellectual trouble, which means you don't particularly know how it's going to turn out and what it's about. And I find that most pleasurable and perhaps most progressive about work. And so it plays an aspect of it, but how I think about it is hard to say. I generally am not a terribly nostalgic person, although during the pandemic, I really missed eating duck.
Have you gotten any yet?
I can't.
Oh, nice.
To get duck.
Okay, actually, I have to ask you one last question quickly. I just wanted to end by thinking about how you're doing with screens now that we're basically living our entire lives through screens. How's it going for you?
This is my second screen anything. Third, actually.
Oh.
So, okay. No one knows my email. No one knows how to get a hold of me. And so I don't have any meetings of any kind. Also, I'm a questionable artist and no one really wants to talk to me. So it's been perfectly fine. I think the remote learning stuff for kids is terrible. I have a daughter. And so I think we're all dealing with screens in terms of remote learning. That might be the most salient thing about it. It's like, how do we learn in screens and devices where they were created for distraction? Right. You know, I think that's truly one of the real paradoxes of what we're living through right now. Because on the one hand, everyone is trying to remote learn, from college students to elementary school students, but they have to do it on devices where they're made to distract us 24/7. So how do you provide that kind of focus on devices that weren't made for this? You know what I mean? That's a real question. I don't have an answer for it, but I think this is something that we all have to grapple with. And this is truly the screen age. This is really the question of the screen age. When the technology is made such that they are meant to give us a kind of experience that does not allow us for a kind of reflection that may matter most.
Great. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end. I wish we could keep talking, but we're a little over time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. This was really great. And thank you everyone who tuned in.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Okay, and join us next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.